I'm Russ Cassady, regional editor of Appalachian Newspapers. I'm joined here with Vanderbeck, publisher of Appalachian Newspapers, and we're joined by Tyler Syck, who is the director of the University of Pikeville's Center for Public Service. And we're just going to talk a little bit about the May 19th primary election, the results, and kind of what that means going forward. Thank you all for joining us. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks. Like I say to people, thanks for being had. But I think the candidates, in most cases, did a very good job running for the elected offices. As you know, I've done some public forums with a lot of these people, and a lot of the candidates had some really, really good ideas. And I implored each candidate, win, lose, or draw, to clearly, if they lost, don't bow out. Just, be part of the program, be part of the solution, because we got a lot of problems. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna, talk a little bit about what you guys are thinking about this thing, and I'm glad you guys are here, you and Tyler, because you're really smarter than I am, because I'm just a mouthpiece for some of the stuff that we've got. So Tyler, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk from the outset about the turnout, which was surprising to me. As Tyler and I have discussed, a typical turnout for an election, a primary elections, somewhere between 10 to 15%. Statewide, it was at 25%, which that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is pretty significant, right, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, it's about 10 to 15% more than it ever usually is in an election like this. Even primary elections during a presidential year don't usually hit quite this high. So,
What's your take on that? I mean, I mean, we have people who are. I mean, they say veterans go out and the people go out and fight for our freedom. And what's your take on 15 or 20% attendance or showing up in the primary?
oh, I mean, it's pitiful. I mean, it should
Listen,
be 100%.
don't sugarcoat it.
I mean, it should be 100%. I mean, we as you point out, we have people who die for our right to go vote, and then people don't go vote.
Yeah.
And it's really important primary to go vote. I mean, the general election, I mean, especially, I mean, this is no secret, the primary has decided many of the elections here in Pike County.
Yeah.
And so you should go out and vote in your
Sure.
primary. And also there's tons of studies that show that the people who most often vote in primaries are the hyperpartisan people, the people who are the most Republican and the most Democrat,
Sure.
which gives you a certain sort of nominee to choose from in November. And there's this is one of the reasons why so many voters are unhappy come November with their options, but they didn't do their part to try and get better ones.
Right. Well, I made two predictions on Monday, and they both came true. I said that in Pike County, or in this election, the candidate with the most vote is going to win, and that came true. And then the second prediction I made is that Ray Jones will not win, and that came true too. So, I'm 2 for 2. But that point that you just made about, the primary going into the general, Russ has got an interesting perspective on the Andy Barr Charles Booker race that we were talking about off camera before. So let's talk about that race.
Yeah,
Russ.
yeah. So obviously, one candidate who won big was Andy Barr in the Republican primary to replace U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell. And of course, Barr was supported by and heavily supported President Trump. While on the Democratic side, you had Charles Booker win the nomination, and Charles Booker is the exact opposite.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I'm interested to see over the next few months, we've not really seen the totality of the impacts of the Trump administration's policies on rural and, lower income individuals. And we still won't see a lot of those until after this midterm election in November. But I wonder, as the economy continues to flag, as the war in Iran, as the Epstein files controversy continues to go on, does that be, become a weight on Andy Barr and a plus for Charles Booker?
I mean, I think it's a possibility, though after last night, I think it's hard to say that for sure. Andy Barr won big, Thomas Massey lost.
Yeah.
Largely, it seems because Donald Trump wanted him to lose.
Right.
So there does seem to be a way in which, at least after last night, like Donald Trump's influence over the Republican Party in the state of Kentucky is bigger than it ever has been. even while, as you point out, in other respects, his popularity is declining nationally and even among Republicans. So I don't know. I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, one of the biggest trends that our Secretary of State likes to point out is a lot of people are switching to Republican in Kentucky, even more are switching to Independent.
Yeah.
Where do they go?
Right.
And those will be those will be the interesting ones to see in November. But I think in an interesting way, Charles Booker is maybe not the ideal Democratic candidate designed to win over people who've left the Democratic Party to become independents either.
Yeah.
So
I mean, he's very, very
he's
much
very,
score-
very, very progressive,
Yeah,
which
very
is an
cool.
advantage in some ways, but it's also a disadvantage, perhaps.
Well, and how much of a factor does Donald Trump play, I wonder, in this, election? Does he come and speak for Andy Barr? How much does he factor in this, I wonder?
I mean, I think it depends how close it gets.
And
I
now,
mean,
in your opinion, two things happened yesterday that just ruffled my feathers. I'm a registered Republican. Um, I believe in the conservative values, but there's some things that happened yesterday that just really bugged the living crap out of me. The first thing is that we got $1.8 billion to secure the from the IRS. That's going to start a new militia. I don't care what anybody says. The new militia for the insurrectionists will be started with this $1.8 billion. You're going to have an interior militia where a civil war 2.0 is probably imminent. So I think that's happening. The second thing that happened is I'm going to change my name to Trump, and I'm going to screw the IRS out of every dollar I can because they can't do that. So now the Trump and the Trump family and the Trump businesses are never going to be looked at by the IRS, so they could do anything they want. At what point, with the gas prices and the Trump is looking at the United States and taxpayers as his own little bankroll, at what point do moderate conservatives get to the point where they say, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want this to happen. I need a moderate person in here who has some common sense and where our leaders live by the rules that we all live by, not the rules that they make up as they go along.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. And I do think in some ways Kentucky is a hard test case to sort of examine this thesis. Because one thing, it isn't a state made up by and large of a lot of moderate conservatives. It's very, very Republican. But then on the flip side, Andy Barr, backed by Donald Trump, but on policy issues is probably like the moderate candidate. So he has this interesting dynamic that probably helps him in both ways. Whereas Thomas Massey, on the other hand, was never really known as a moderate Republican before he stood up. I mean, he really just doesn't like Donald Trump, which isn't necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an odd dynamic there. But I do think we are starting to see in a variety of polling situations, President Trump's support falling away, even among Republicans. But it does seem, I mean, when you look at the polling, there is a sort of core constituency that just will never abandon him, I think. And the interesting thing to see, kind of an analytical perspective, is where is that floor? Is it 25%? Is it 30%? Is it? And I don't know yet. I don't know when we'll know when we've hit it.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point about Andy Barr. He does represent in some ways, despite the Trump support and things, that he is really an establishment candidate. And you see establishment candidates also. U.S. Representative Hal Rogers absolutely had a field day in his field yesterday. And he will face a Democrat, Ned Pillersdorf, in November. But still, that establishment still does appear to hold strong, even in this environment of a rejection of the establishment.
Yeah. Well, in an interesting way, I mean, Barr also, he represented the only congressional district in Kentucky that's anywhere close to being a swing district.
Yeah.
He knows how to talk to Democrats and to moderate Republicans because that's what he's had to do his whole political career. Right. But he also, he really proved in this election that he knows how to talk to the really deep red parts of Kentucky as well. And it paid off 60% of the vote. I mean, that's
Exactly.
huge.
Yeah, that's very big.
It is. Well, and we had some, legislative races here in our coverage area decided as well, or at least the nominees, for the state Senate in the 30th Senatorial District, which represents Perry County. Of course, we published the Hazard Herald. Brandon Smith, the incumbent, won from his challenge from Billy Wesley. And then, here in Pike County and Floyd County, we had the 95th district state representative race, the Republican nominees, and there is a Democrat on the other side of that as well. That Tanner Hesterberg won a pretty sound victory of 66% over Willie Grace Jr. Hesterberg is going to be facing a challenge from Johnny Ray Turner, who is in many ways a political institution and has served in the Senate. He's got a name, and Tanner is a new candidate. So it's going to be interesting to see how the party politics and things of that nature play in that race as well.
Yeah, that's to me one of the big races to watch, because if you're a Democrat trying to win or keep really in the 95th district, Johnny Ray Turner is the sort of Democrat you want. Somebody with name recognition, establishment, not too liberal, not too progressive, could win. But there's also some baggage with being an establishment figure, which we saw in some of the races yesterday. And also, the district is a lot more Republican than it was when Johnny Ray Turner.
Well, that 95th district seat is actually the last House or Senate seat left east of Winchester that's held by a Democrat.
Yeah.
With, of course, Ashley Tackett Larry.
And so it matters a lot to the Democrats to keep it, but it also matters a lot to the Republicans to take it. And so I think both parties are going to be really trying their best.
I think
grab
that's
that
gonna. I
seat.
think you're going to see a record-setting expenditure by state pundits and state PACs to get those two.
Yep.
One of those two.
I think that's absolutely right.
You're going to see a lot of people spending a lot of money on Tanner and a lot of people spending a lot of money on Johnny Ray.
I think that's true.
And I think that's probably going to be one of the most contested, like you said, and also most expensive races we'll see in the fall.
Yeah. And and it's it'll be an interesting litmus test on the way partisanship is breaking down and the future of Eastern Kentucky.
Right. Well, and as Tyler and I were discussing off camera, Pike County, for example, has been a majority Democrat county for generations. And it used to be that the local races were decided in the Democratic primary because we only had Democrats running. Well, we had kind of reversal this year with the change, and a lot of the local offices were decided in the Republican primary this time. For example, in Pike County, we had Susie Gibson Shearer win a victory over Brian Morris, which, was an interesting race and probably the biggest local race in Pike County.
Well, that's the judge executive. That's the CEO. That's the CEO of the county. I mean, the judge executive is the CEO of the county, and Susie's a newcomer to politics per se. Brian's been a jailer for 10 years, and he was a deputy judge executive, and he got beat by Susie Gibson and Gibson Shearer, and that was an interesting race, and it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out, because there's a lot of even though you've got the sheriff, the jailer, the coroner, the library board member, and all these other magistrates, everything starts with the judge executive, and the judge executive is the person that is the CEO, and that person
Sets the tone.
sets the tone for everything that happens in the county, good, bad, or indifferent. Whether you like the person. I mean, Ray Jones. A lot of people don't like Ray Jones, but he has done a great job on getting the county back on fiscal responsibility, and that meant bonding things out, firing people who weren't doing their job, cutting services, getting new equipment that we had to buy differently so that people don't get their arms cut off by lawnmowers and blades flying off. But, we're going to see how that works out. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out come January of 2027 for the next 4 years. It's going to be interesting. And again, that was a good race. And I wish Susie the best of luck on that, because county's going to need it. We're kind of, this county's there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed with the county, and she's got her work cut out for her.
Yeah. From the public service, or the, I guess, the community perspective, how big of a factor is it going to be in these counties with their budgets, especially in Kentucky counties that are losing money with coal severance and all these sources?
It's probably the biggest. I mean, you have been doing this longer than I have, but I would say it's probably the biggest financial crisis a lot of these eastern Kentucky counties have faced in a very long time. It's going to be a serious, because they're used to, in many ways, relying on coal severance money for their budget. But by its very nature, coal severance money is not a permanent fixture of your budget. And now it's drying up, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious alternative revenue stream. And you can't raise taxes too much more in the counties. And I don't know. I mean, I think that kind of fiscal responsibility you talked about Ray Jones having is sort of exactly what the judge executives are going to need, but I think that's going to be hard.
To
It's going to,
maintain that.
it's
Yeah.
going to be hard to maintain that, because I think that takes real skill, that takes real business acumen, and when the budget shrinking as drastically as it's about to shrink, it's going to take real efficiency. You're going to need to be able to hire people who are hyper competent and who can do the work of 3 people, because you're going to have to let go 2 people, just to make ends meet.
Sure. And those people who are highly competent don't come cheap.
No, they don't come cheap, and there aren't that many of them.
Right.
I mean, people like that are, if there were people that great everywhere, the world would run so much better than it does. I mean,
One of the things during the forums that we talked about on some of these magistrate forums and stuff, everybody said that, they're going to get grants. They want to get grants. And Sharon Hall, who's a grant writer, she's gotten millions and millions of dollars for Pike County. And there's been a lot of grant writing talk lately. What's your opinion on a county hanging its hat on grants?
I mean, I write grants, I get grants, I like grants. It's not a super reliable source of income in some ways. And I think we saw this in the changes in the last federal administration. A lot of these grants are federal. And when the federal government's priorities changed, so do the grant priorities. The Trump administration canceled a lot of grants. Didn't affect Pike County that much because the priorities of the Trump administration were predominantly rural. But who's to say that isn't going to happen?
Sure.
And then if you've based your entire income on grants as opposed to coal severance, federal administration changes, doesn't have the priorities that are funding you, that money goes away overnight, faster than coal severance. I think grants are a great way to kickstart things, new programs, get them off the ground. But almost every grant asks you to build into the grant itself.
Yeah.
Some way to sustain it outside of the period of the grant. And that's where it's hard, especially if most of your budget is grants.
So one of the things that just happened recently, and here's where I'm struggling with. One of the things that happened recently up in Johnson County, Mark McKenzie, Bobby McCool, and Senator Wheeler helped get $2.7 million for a baseball field or an athletic complex. It's going to have pickleball, soccer, all this. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. It's great. On paper, it looks great. My question, and there was grant money for that. My question to the next set of leaders and to Mark McKenzie is, what happens when this thing is built? How are you going to sustain this? Who's going to cut the grass? Who's going to maintain it? Because if you don't maintain the turf, it dies in 3 years, and then and you can't use grant money to maintain it.
No, grants hate paying for that kind of thing.
They don't pay for that stuff.
No, they don't. Yeah,
but I think a lot of people have a misconception that we're going to get a grant to maintain it, and that's just impossible.
No, the grants don't pay for that. And this is what you have to think of when you write a grant. How are we going to maintain it after the grant?
Right.
And this is something really that historically our leaders struggle with, I think, in Eastern Kentucky. We've built all these fantastic parks all over Pike County with coal severance money. How are we going to sustain them after coal severance? We have no plan for this.
Right.
And parks also have to be maintained. Maintenance is, so when you're building these wonderful things that your counties need, top of the mind should be what happens after we built it.
Yeah.
How do we sustain it? And grants don't do that. And you could say, well, maybe private donors who can do things like that.
Yeah, well,
But how many private donors are you going to round up and get to pay for this kind
it
of
used to
thing?
be the coal companies would throw some money at the fiscal court to help that because they know that their families live next to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But their coal companies are gone.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned, Russ, about Perry County. You got Scott Alexander, the incumbent Democrat judge executive. He's going to have a challenger. You got Brandon Smith, the representative who's a Republican. You got the mayor, Happy Mobilini. Those three are, I know the mayor's nonpartisan. Smith is a Republican. Judge Alexander's a Democrat. But I've never seen those people work so close together to get the stuff. They're always at meetings together. They're always supporting each other, even though they are on different parties per se. And I don't know if that hurts Brandon because he's helping a Democrat judge executive. And I don't know if it hurts the Democrat judge executive because he's buddying up with a Republican congressperson from the state of Kentucky. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, I'll say something kind of controversial. I think it's strange these local elections are partisan, anyways. Because I mean, what matters at the end of the day is how you're going to run the county, which isn't really a question of party all that much. And I think, but I mean, at the end of the day, and we've seen this a little bit in Pike County with a Democratic judge executive and a Republican fiscal court. You have to work with you have to build a good community for the people you're serving. And that requires working with the people you've got. And if it's a Democrat or if it's a Republican, you got to work together. And I think it's a real advantage for the county. Politically, this is the case. It could be a real disadvantage.
Sure, right.
Because I mean, it could be perceived as, and it often is when you work with the other side, as disloyalty to your own party.
Sure, because you have a lawmaker out in Western Kentucky who says, "Listen, Brandon Smith, I know you've been bringing money back to your district, and you're giving it to the Democratic judge executive. And if you don't agree with me on the Republican side, I'm not going to allow you to have this. So you scratch my back, I won't scratch your back."
Absolutely, and because the parties demand real, almost absolute loyalty these days, which works so counter to what it actually takes to govern a county or a city,
Right.
which is a real problem.
You mentioned some of these races are partisan. Why on earth is the jailer? Why on earth is the coroner? Why on earth is the sheriff? Why do we have to pick them as a Republican or Democrat?
Well, I mean,
So Russ has been in this market. I mean, he's been here for 25, 30 years doing this stuff.
Makes no sense.
It makes no sense to do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm an independent, so I didn't get a vote yesterday. So that's a good example.
But it wasn't designed to make sense, though. I think it was designed to give parties control over these local offices, largely as a form of patronage. In the 19th century, when we started to develop the first real American party system, part of the way it worked was doling out local jobs to the party faithful. So you make everything partisan so that you can keep doing that. And it's blatantly corrupt. It's still often blatantly corrupt, but it's by design.
Well, one thing I've noted to move on.
That's not remotely
I'm
encouraging.
shutting
You
you
just brought my depression to a brand new low.
Well, one thing I've noted is that there is at least an appearance that there's a dissatisfaction among the electorate with the way things are, which, when I was looking at these results, my first thing when I saw this election roster being set this year is that, incumbents are going to be somewhat vulnerable. However, Johnson County, the judge executive, received the renomination. The sheriff, Scott Hazlett, he received the renomination. In Perry County, you mentioned Scott Alexander. He won his nomination in the Democratic Party. He's facing a challenge from Denny Ray Noble, who's a Republican and a former judge executive. Happy Mobilini, who's the mayor in Hazard, he won re-election. So a lot of these officials did win re-election. So, am I misreading that there's dissatisfaction, or do you think that they're not pinning their dissatisfaction to these local officials as much?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I mean, there's been all kinds of studies that Congress, for instance, at the federal level, U.S. Congress is really, really unpopular, but everybody really likes their congressman. And so there could be a little bit of that going with the local races. They're upset with the system, but they're like, and they hate the establishment. They're like, my judge executive, who's a member of the state, he's fine, or something like this. So there could be a bit of that. I think there could be the dynamic that the people who vote, these establishment figures are really good at getting their supporters to vote in the primaries, as opposed to the large hunk of sort of dissatisfied people who are maybe not too terribly politically engaged and don't vote in primaries. And we know this, a lot of the people who are most dissatisfied with politics right now don't actually engage in politics because they're so dissatisfied they don't see a point even in engaging. Um, I think it's probably some mixture of those two things, though.
All right. Well, and I'm going to ask for a prediction here, and I'm not asking for a prediction of who's going to win any race.
The person with the most
Calm down,
votes.
Joe. We saw it's an unfortunately fantastic turnout, to go back to that, in the primary election. Does that carry over to this general election?